Welcome to another Top Grades video made easy. Today I am cooking up an essay plan which is going to fit every question that comes up in the exam. Prepare to be amazed. So, in 2024, my prediction is that you will always get a theme question. Obviously you do. If you study the inspector, that will be easy to fit to any theme question. And the character is most likely to be Gerald. It's got about a 50% chance of coming up, I reckon. And I'm going to show you how this plan will fit not just a question on the inspector, not just a question on Gerald, but every single question. We dive in with the thesis statement. This is where you say what Priestley's point of view is. So he's writing the play to promote socialism, to recommend that we need social responsibility to look after the working classes, and we need to stop exploiting women. And then finally, this is also not just an anti-capitalist play, it is an anti-war play. You might not have been taught that, but it will all become clear. And by the way, just pick the ideas that make sense to you. So, in at number 1, the most important moment at the beginning of the play is when Birling says, a man has to look after himself and his family. His point is, there's no such thing as wider society, there is no social responsibility, there is only personal responsibility. The words that he says immediately lead to bring, the doorbell ringing, because like an incantation they summon the inspector. He arrives exactly and in fact interrupts what Birling is saying. This is Priestley's way of showing a kind of supernatural reaction to Birling's selfishness and rejection of social responsibility. And so his words act as a kind of spell that summon the ghoul. So you can introduce that supernatural element there if you want to, or simply take the inspector as a real person with no supernatural connotations. It's up to you. Right, then we have the discussion of how Eva was sacked. Now the most important part of that discussion is that Eric and Sheila immediately reject Birling's position, but Gerald, who Sheila's going to marry, doesn't. She says they're not cheap labour, they're people. Obviously, this reinforces the message of social responsibility and socialism. But they're also real people, but women. Priestley deliberately chooses all the victims in this play to be female. The main victim obviously is Eva, but we can also look at Mrs. Birling as a victim of her husband, because he's clearly had affairs in the past, and most obviously Sheila. She discovers Gerald's affair, she confronts him with it, but at the end, will that be enough? We'll see when we get to number 9. Right, at number 3, we need something to introduce the play as a morality tale. So in morality plays, actors didn't play real people, they played constructs who represented the sins or the virtues. The 7 deadly sins you'll be familiar with, and one of them is jealousy, and the inspector points out to Sheila that she had Eva sacked because she was jealous. Now, yes, that's one of the deadly sins, but Priestley uses it to reinforce a feminist message, because Sheila says she couldn't feel sorry for her and that the girl could look after herself. What she means is patriarchal society values a woman's appearance as their most important quality. And because Eva is better looking than Sheila, in Sheila's eyes, then that justifies her jealousy in getting her sacked, and also justifies her thinking, well, she's lost a job, but she'll get another one, or she'll find a nice man and get married, and that's what society rewards. I don't feel guilty. The inspector confronts her with that guilt, but Priestley's wider message is that Sheila's cruelty is not just because she's upper class, it's because she's been taught by society that the most important thing about being a woman is your appearance. And Priestley wants to go against that. He explores that through Sheila, so her transformation through the play is a way of him exploring the inner lives of women and calling for a more feminist society. This gives us a contrast to Gerald, who is, if you like, an antithesis to Sheila. And she describes him as seeing himself as a prince because he has rescued Eva Daisy when she appeared to be in trouble. However, Priestley is kind of unpicking this as a facade. Gerald sees himself as the prince who installs her in a nice little set of rooms, is the quote, and gives her money, affection, and then after a few months bids her goodbye. However, Priestley lays the ground for us being much more cynical about this prince. We see him as a Machiavellian figure. Machiavelli wrote the book The Prince, and as exploiting her. How do we know? Well, he had these keys to a set of rooms. Why? Well, his friend went off to Canada and said, I've got this nice little set of rooms, why don't you put a woman in there? Have some fun while I'm away. Also, when he comes back, Gerald gets rid of Eva. Says, no, my friend's come back, we can't have the flat anymore. But what he really means is, I'm not willing to pay for you to stay anywhere, so the relationship I have with you and the way I'm sexually exploiting you isn't even worth the money I would pay in rent of some rooms for you. So he completely uses her and gets her financially on the cheap. And he confesses that she was probably in love with him, and so that makes his exploitation even worse. That's why I hate Gerald. Now we come to Eric. The crucial quote is that he says, I was in that state where a chap easily turns nasty. We've got all this kind of language where I was in a state where a chap, nasty, these are all euphemisms for the sexual violence that he's threatening Eva with. But he doesn't voice it because he doesn't want to admit to himself what a horrible human being he is. Now, we've had two exploitative males, one Machiavellian, one much more lustful and violent. What's Priestley saying? He's saying that it is upper class men and their natural exploitation of people through capitalism that leads them also to think it is appropriate to naturally exploit the powerless. Those with least power in society are women, and therefore they are the greater victims. So I think Priestley puts most blame on these two men, much more than Birling and much more than Mrs. Birling. Another clue to that is Eva's method of suicide, which I won't go into here, but if you think about it, it shows you how horrified she is about what Eric has done to her, and that's why she wants to destroy herself in that particular way. Now we come to girls of that class. My favourite quote for Mrs. Birling, because it shows how prejudiced she is against the working classes and also against her own sex. She belittles Eva as a mere girl, even though she's pregnant when she visits her. This allows Mrs. Birling to deny Eva charity without feeling any guilt. Mrs. Birling never admits any guilt, she just says, I did nothing wrong. So many people see this as the worst because she was the one who had the opportunity to save Eva by giving her money. I personally don't see that because Eva could have accepted money from Eric. She just chose to turn him down because he was stealing it from his father's business. So we can't really argue that Eva wants to kill herself because she doesn't want to accept stolen money. That just isn't logical. There are much deeper psychological reasons, and they are how she has been exploited. Mrs. Birling is cruel, but she doesn't actually exploit Eva. Of course, you don't need to share my view about Mrs. Birling here. You can argue that she is the very worst character because she was the last port of call, and if she had given Eva money, the tragedy might not have happened. Go ahead and argue that. I just personally don't. Now we come to the inspector's most important and final words, where he talks about the millions of Evas and the millions of John Smiths. And if men will not learn that lesson, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. It's men again. So again, a feminist text that's saying the people who need to change are the men, because men have power in this patriarchal society, and therefore they are the ones who can change society. So that is going to give us an important interpretation of the ending when we get to number 9, because although Sheila learns the inspector's lesson, does she have the power to change society when she's only, I say only, in terms of patriarchal terms, a woman who is denied power? The words fire and blood and anguish are not just about the factories and the workplace and people going on strike. No, they're much more specific, and they're warning us against coming war. So here you can explore the setting of 1912, just before the First World War, and also the irony that the audience have just lived through the Second World War and therefore have war at the forefront of their mind. Priestley's argument is capitalism leads to war. So, a little history for you here. Who makes the most money out of war? The factory owners. They are the ones who produce the raw materials and the products that are necessary in the war. This was a big deal at the time because the First World War had made lots of families and lots of businesses uber rich. Birling's business and Croft's business would have done exactly the same. Now, you don't have to explain all that in your essay, you will just reference it as capitalist exploitation of prices and products during the war meant that they profiteered from the First World War and the Second World War, and therefore capitalists approved of war because it led to greater profits. Boom, that's my sentence done. That is Priestley's point of view, and that's what he's warning the audience of. You've lived through 2 world wars. Do you want to live through a third? I hope not. The way out of it is to develop social responsibility, vote for a socialist government. Everything will be fine. Then we have the reaction of Birling and Gerald and Mrs. Birling. So Gerald makes this brilliant excuse to the inspector and says, oh, I've been so upset by finding out that Daisy's dead, I've got to go out for a walk. But what he's really doing is going out to find a policeman he knows to see if the inspector is a real inspector. He finds out that he's not, comes back, and obviously Birling is ecstatic and starts laughing at his children, who he dismisses as the famous younger generation. In other words, implying that there's nothing special about them and they're in fact quite stupid. And this gives us the strong clue that they won't be allowed to have power between the First World War and the Second World War. What's Priestley up to? He's saying that Birling's generation and Gerald's generation is responsible for leading the country to the Second World War, when everybody believed we could never go to war again because the First World War was known as the war to end all wars. It was so horrific. So Priestley discredits Gerald and discredits the Birlings by showing how dismissive and unsympathetic they are of their own children, but also of the hope of the younger generation generally, the hope for the future. Then we come to Sheila, who is perhaps our greatest hope with Eric of changing that future. So she has rejected her engagement with Gerald, but now that he has satisfied her parents that the inspector wasn't real and therefore what they did didn't matter, he offers her the engagement ring again. And she says, no, it's too soon, not yet, I must think. Now, what does this mean? It invites us to imagine that at some point after the curtain goes down, she will eventually say yes to Gerald. Why would she do that if she's learnt the inspector's lesson and she's learnt that we must stop exploiting women and workers? Well, does she have a real choice? If she wants to escape the control of her father, the only way to do that is through marriage. And is she going to find a better match? Well, the play's description of Eric's behaviour tells us that Gerald is actually quite a decent example of an upper class man, unlike her brother, who is perhaps more typical. At least this makes him a superior match, and obviously socially he's superior as well. Patriarchal society and the class-bound society she lives in forces her really to accept Gerald as the best match she can get. Does Eric learn the lesson? Well, maybe he does. He says he does, but remember, he's drunk during this part of the play, and so he might metaphorically wake up tomorrow and not remember that lesson properly. But there is another contextual point. The sons of the upper classes died in even greater proportions than the working classes during the First World War. Why? Because they were the officer class. The officers were the first over the top in the trenches, and they were the prime target of snipers and machine gunners. So, symbolically, Birling sacrifices his own son, potentially in war, in order to generate greater profits in his business. Then we come to the ending. Now, yes, we've got this great mystery of the second phone call and the inspector turning up. Who is the new inspector? Is he a kind of metaphorical version of God coming to judge them, or is he just an actual police inspector? So the original inspector just predicted the future and now they're going to live it out again for real. Or is this kind of divine punishment, divine inspection, judging them? We don't know, and Priestley doesn't want us to know. He wants us to wrestle with this problem. However, it also acts symbolically. Eva's death represents the First World War, the second death represents the Second World War. His political message was, if as a society we'd learnt these moral lessons from the First World War, capitalism would not have taken us into the Second World War. So, he's making a direct link between the exploitation of capitalist men in this capitalist patriarchal society and the cause of the Second World War. He wants his readers, his audience I should say, in the theatre, who would have been mainly female because the men are still off at war, he wants them to vote for a Labour government that is going to give them a socially responsible world to live in. It won't just make capitalism less damaging, it is going to stop war, fire and blood and anguish. So this plan will fit absolutely every essay. I've tried to show you how it gives us an insight into each of the characters so that you could use it as part of a character question. But let me go a little deeper for you. So let's imagine the question is about Gerald. Like, would I have to come up with lots more Gerald quotes? No, this is the genius of the plan. If you stick to these moments in the play, you would then just say, what does this reveal about Gerald? Gerald completely agrees with Birling's view. That's why he's there to make a family alliance, which you remember is also going to be a business alliance between Crofts and Birlings. Number two, they're not cheap labour. Well, Gerald's perspective goes against Sheila's. He does believe they are cheap labour, and he doesn't want to treat them as people. Why? Because he wants greater profits, just like Birling. He is also one of the deadly sins, where Sheila is jealousy, he is greed or lust, depending on which one you want to choose. Whereas with Sheila, this showed how she is controlled by patriarchal society. His lust shows how he is controlling patriarchal society of vulnerable women, which links back to our feminist perspective. He sees himself as the prince. Obviously everything I said there and about the nice little set of rooms, the way he exploits Daisy, Eva, obviously fits Gerald. Chap easily turns nasty. I've touched on how Gerald is a kind of parallel to Eric, but also an antithesis to him. Priestley is saying, look, Gerald is much better than Eric, but actually he's still awful, and that's the point of the comparison, and it helps us see why Sheila might feel she needs to take him back at the end. Girls of that class. Interestingly, Gerald doesn't say anything which makes him support the class system. He doesn't seem to be particularly fussed about the hierarchy in society. What drives him instead is power and money, and being a man, having patriarchal control over women. The fact that he can only do that because he's upper class doesn't really interest him. So what Priestley could be saying here is, look, even if we got rid of the class system, it's not going to make society better, because people still need to feel socially responsible, and we still need to stop exploiting women. Class is not the main message of my play. Gerald proves that. Fire and blood and anguish, everything I've said about that fits an attack against Gerald's view of the world, which is the opposite of the inspector's view of the world. I've told you how it was Gerald who exposes the hoax and why, so it's going to be easy to attach that to an essay about Gerald. Number 9, Sheila's words, but they're all dependent on society's promotion of Gerald and patriarchal society controlling her decisions and her freedom, so that's easy to relate to Gerald, and so's that, the second phone call. He hasn't learnt the lesson. He is a symbol of men in power in society who are going to lead us to war. He is therefore a symbol of what Priestley wants to reject. What if the question is about the inspector? Well, obviously, we've talked about how this summons the inspector and why. This is the message that the inspector's trying to deliver, and Sheila is a proxy for the inspector's voice. He is there to expose the 7 deadly sins of the Birling family. So we've got pride, which is Mrs. Birling, we've got greed, which is Birling, we've got lust, which is Gerald, and so on. They can each be stock characters in a morality play. This helps us explain the Christian context of the play. We are members of one body. Remember, is language that comes from the service in church, the communion, the Eucharist. And Priestley's point is, if you are a Christian, and nearly all of his audience would have been, then in all conscience you can only be in favour of social responsibility, and therefore politically you can't vote for a Conservative government, you must vote for a socialist one. It's the only thing a good Christian can do. The inspector wants to expose Gerald. He's not really a prince. Instead, he is a Machiavellian figure who controls women. He wants to expose Eric for his sexual violence and control of women, because he's saying with both of these two characters that the worst thing in society is powerful men. He wants to expose Mrs. Birling's prejudice, either to suggest she's not as bad as the men, or, if you prefer, she is the final straw and represents the welfare state that should look after the poor but doesn't. It's left in the hand of prejudiced women like Mrs. Birling. Obviously, his final words we fully explored. He is there to educate the younger generation. Remember that he says that they are more impressionable. Those are the ones who are going to learn the lesson. So the inspector is directly, if you like, stepping out of the play almost and saying to the audience, look, it's you, the young people in the audience, that are going to make the difference to society going forward. You'll bring about social responsibility and socialism. The inspector leaves in order for the Birlings and Gerald to work out their reaction. And so he is very sympathetic towards Sheila and knows that he has taught her the lesson, but he's leaving her to decide whether she acts on that lesson or goes against it. Even though she's most powerfully learnt the lesson, society is going to prevent her from acting on it properly, and that I believe she probably will accept Gerald. You don't have to accept that, of course, you can see it the other way, that she is the hope for the future, but because she's a woman she doesn't get that power, and she could still reject Gerald but still not be able to influence what happens in society. And then the ending of the play brings us back to the inspector. So now the inspector becomes a much more supernatural or divine figure who's there to expose the wrongdoing in society and keep exposing it. That's what this circular pattern is. Keep exposing it until society improves. So what you saw that I did there with both Gerald and the inspector is I didn't start rushing around the rest of the play to get loads of different references and loads of different quotes. I can, but that's not the point of the video. The point of the video is to show you that if you take the character and just keep bringing them back to these moments in the play, you will always be able to make it relevant to that character. And the same with any theme, because whatever the theme question is, whether it's about men or women or capitalism or socialism, whatever it is, it's actually this. What does Priestley want to achieve? He wants to get through these messages. How does he do it? He does it through these key moments in the play. And so this will fit any theme question and any character question. If you would like to get some essays that are grade 7 and grade 9, there is a link in the description. They answer this question. And if you want to watch a video on a grade 9 essay, that's the one cooking up now!